Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. I'm very delighted today to have with us Dr. Thierno Thiam. Dr. Thierno Thiam is currently the chair of the Department of History and Political Science. He's also co-director of the Integrative Public Policy and Development PhD program and a professor of political science and international relations. He joined Tuskegee University in 2020 from the Institute for State Effectiveness based in Washington, DC. The ISE blends conceptual thought, analysis, and direct experience to rethink relations between citizens, states, and market in the globalized world. At the Institute for State Effectiveness, Dr. Thiam was in charge of the report that detailed Rwanda's institutional transformation. Dr. Thiam's work has been featured in various outlets, including the Paragraph Macmillan Speakers Series, Spring Nature, the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations, as well as various US and international news outlets. Additionally, he has lectured extensively across Africa, Asia, Latin America, the US, and Europe. He is the author of 3 books and a variety of articles. In 2021, Dr. Thiam was selected by CSTN to be a part of a group of scholars charged with the mission to evaluate the leadership effectiveness of the past 45th US presidents. This work constitutes a reference for presidential effectiveness studies and continues to be widely cited by the press. Thank you so very much for being here, Dr. Thiam. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sar. Let me pull up the PowerPoint presentation. So today I'm here actually to talk about the impact of HBCUs, especially on Africa, but a matter of context might be needed before we go any further. Let's see if it's perfect. And to understand really
what happened?
Can you hear me?
We lost you for a while, but now we can hear you.
Okay, we're good now. Perfect.
Okay, yes.
Perfect. So let me put it in context. To understand HBCUs, we have to understand it within the context of Pan-Africanism. The idea that all people of African stock are one, and the idea also that some form of unity is needed for the progress of people of African stock. But then it falls within what I call the triad of Black institutions, and that includes the Black church. And here I have a picture of Mother Emanuel Church, which was the first African-American church founded on the notion that Black people can be leaders in the church. Because if you remember, during the times of segregation, Black people were supposed to worship, were supposed to sit in the back of the pews, but were not supposed to rise to the position of leadership. So in 1816, they broke away and founded what would be the first Black church in Charleston, South Carolina. Incidentally, for those of you who have been following events, in 2015, with the shooting and the killing of 9 worshipers, including the pastor himself, there was a message there from white supremacists that they understood what this church was created to do. And again, the second big pillar is the Black press. And here again, I have put on the screen the first Black press created, which is Freedom's Journal, created in New York City, New York. And also there's the third pillar, and this is where it becomes slightly controversial because, but I think there's a general agreement now that Cheney University in Cheney, Pennsylvania, is the first historical Black college and university. Moving. Right. Now, the emergence of historically Black colleges and universities. How do we understand it? Well, we have to understand it from the perspective of what we call the Morrill Acts. There was the first Morrill Act and the second Morrill Act. What was the first Morrill Act designed to do? Pull this thing down here at the bottom. Perfect. So the first Morrill Act in 1862 was basically about establishing what would be known as the land grant system, land grant institutions, designed to basically include those people who have been traditionally excluded from the system. So that's why the principle was based on equity, it was based on non-hierarchy, and it was based on practicality. And I think the best summary comes to us from a noted historian of land grant institutions, Earl D. Ross. And then I have the citation here, basically turning the university system into what he calls the real people's colleges, and then also the fullest expression of American democracy in higher education. My colleagues,
we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
I can hear you just fine. I've not lost your voice.
Okay, perfect.
I can hear you fine. I think you're fine.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So when you look at what my colleagues, I would say my colleagues in agriculture love to think of the first Morrill Act as an act of agriculture. And I love to remind them that actually the first Morrill Act, and most importantly, perhaps even the second Morrill Act, were not acts of agriculture, but they were political acts. They were an act of, they were acts of democracy. So fundamentally, they were social and economic acts, not just an act to create agriculture institutions. Move to the next slide. So the second Morrill Act, 1890. This marked the birth of what we know today as historically Black colleges and universities, and the reaffirmation of American democracy. Why do I say that? We have to remember that prior to 1964, a landmark date in American history, the Voting Rights Act, that period that preceded it was an environment of legal segregation. So the second Morrill Act came, the reason it came is because the first Morrill Act did a very good deal and did a very good job at establishing, at making sure that the average citizen could have access to college, but it did not go far enough. It did not go far enough because it still excluded substantial amounts of a substantial number of people in this country, including African Americans. So the second Morrill Act came, in fact, to correct this. And by doing so, it contributed substantially to the progress of African Americans. And here I have a symbol of basically the idea that HBCUs are punching below their weight and far above their weight. If we just look at the numbers, we have in this country 101 HBCUs, which represent only 3% of the nation's colleges and universities. And yet they educate 80% of the country's African-American judges and 50% of its African-American attorneys. So 30% of everyone graduating in the STEM disciplines with a doctorate degree are from HBCUs. So the domestic impact of HBCUs is well chronicled. And we know it through the production of major figures, major historic figures in this country, including, of course, MLK, Du Bois, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, Thurgood Marshall, the legendary lawyer, Douglas Wilder, first Black governor in this country, Virginia, Toni Morrison, exceptional novelist and Nobel Prize winner, and Lonnie Johnson, one of right now the most renowned scientists in this country. But then this is where my conversation comes in. My argument is actually, when we look at the books, the chronicling of the impact of HBCUs domestically is well chronicled. But what is yet to be chronicled is the impact of HBCUs in Africa. And that can be chronicled through two different ways. First, in terms of the training of African leaders, and second, in terms of the institutional modeling, meaning HBCUs, meaning institutions of higher learning created in Africa, modeled after HBCUs. So the first aspect of it, HBCUs and the training of African leaders. We have to remember first that HBCUs were created on the notion that they had to play a role in the liberation movement. And this is why the first ones created actually were founded as education and liberation institutes. And some of them actually call themselves education theology institutions. As a result, they welcomed not only a wide host of African-American students, but they also welcomed a wide host of African students from the continent. So the idea being African-Americans could only gain redemption if Africa gains redemption itself. So the seeds of Pan-Africanism were already being sown in American universities in general, and HBCUs in particular. And the reason I say that is when you look at actually even the origins of Pan-Africanism, which is basically the movement that is one of the most significant, what I would call the most significant social movements in history for its results, because it contributed to ushering actually significant portions of the civil rights movement in this country, because we quite forget that notion and the idea that early civil rights leaders were in constant communications, and they were cross-fertilizing their ideas with also leaders of the diaspora that came to this country in search of that freedom. So when you look at also the second impact, which is its impact in terms of ushering in African independence, we can never underestimate what Pan-Africanism has done. We look at it through all of its iterations, right? The different Pan-African Congresses, from the first Pan-African Congress held in 1900, the second one in 1919, the 1921, but most importantly, the 1945 Pan-African Congress held in Manchester, which actually demanded that African independence should not be now a thing of an ideal, but a thing that actually Africans have to work towards. As a result, right, even when you look at the participating members of that conference, those were the ones who would go on to become the leaders of the first independent African countries. We remember very well the role that Kwame Nkrumah, who would go on to become Ghana's first president, and de facto then Africa's first independent nation in sub-Saharan Africa, played in how that conference was run. But you go back to its initial stages, right? The 1901, the very first one, we remember that those people who actually instigated the movement, they were both from here, Du Bois, I think of, and also from the diaspora in Trinidad and Tobago, Henry Sylvester Williams, because those two played some fundamental role in making sure that the Congresses actually had an agenda, and that agenda included liberation. So yes, and then the second aspect is when you look at when HBCUs were created, they were created to say, well, again, this is another controversy, because you see some HBCUs like Howard University created on the notion that African Americans can in fact be educated in the liberal arts. They can be educated in terms of thinking about society. When you have other institutions saying, well, we think the focus ought to be on the practical issues, on the economic redemption of African Americans. That is the example of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. But no, regardless of what happened, all of those two institutions and all of the institutions on both sides of the spectrum, those who favored science versus those who favored liberal arts, they would include significant portions of liberal arts education in their curriculum to educate a holistic African American and to educate then a holistic African, because Africans were beginning to discover HBCUs and come in here in droves. So, but what HBCUs did, more than just train them in the practical skills, in science, in math, in writing, and in critical thinking, it was also a moment for those students gathered on that campus to all of a sudden realize that there is something that binds us, something very strong, and that is a sense of African identity and a sense of African consciousness. And for this, we have actually J.H. Oldham, the secretary of the International Missionary Council, who visited Tuskegee Institute back in 1921. And then something stayed with him throughout that visit, because on that visit, he met with 5 African students, 2 Ugandans, 2 Southwest Africans, and 2 Liberians. And he made a critical observation that basically what the striking thing about that visit for him was that now he was meeting with 5 men with a distinct African consciousness. That for the first time he met Africans whose loyalty is not Liberian or Rhodesian or Gold Coast, but African. And that actually marks is a significant marker for the Pan-African consciousness. So HBCUs, we know today, have been very critical in training African independence leaders. We know Kwame Nkrumah went to Lincoln University, an HBCU in Pennsylvania, the first president of Ghana. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria, also is an HBCU product. A matter of fact, 3 HBCU products, Storer, Howard, and Lincoln University. Hastings Banda, Central State University, and Meher College, 2 HBCU, a product of 2 HBCU institutions. And then we're not even including right now the long list of HBCU graduates that filled many of the strategic positions across many, many governments in Africa. And then also we're not even listing all those who stayed to continue the work and who continue to be of significant influence. We know also James Aggrey, considered by many as the father of African education. He believed that the redemption of Africans as well as African Americans could only come through education. He was a proponent of a holistic education that includes women. And we remember his favorite saying that basically if you educate a man, you have educated an individual. But if you educate a woman, you have educated a family, and a family would also be transformed later into a nation. So if you want to educate a nation, what you needed to do is include women in the education process. And he's often referred to as the Booker T. Washington of Africa. And he would go on to mentor many significant leaders in Africa, including Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, eminent Pan-Africanist, and Nnamdi Azikiwe, another eminent Pan-Africanist, and also first president of Nigeria. We also know that Alfred Bitini Xuma was educated at Tuskegee University, got his bachelor's degree from Tuskegee University to become also the first Black South African medical doctor. And also president of the ANC, arguably, and I say this coming from Senegal, the most significant political party in Africa. If you look at what that party achieved, if you look at the symbolic meaning of that party in African consciousness. So he was president from 1940 to 1949. So he's also credited for having revived the ANC, and this comes out straight out of the mouth of Nelson Mandela, that when Xuma came, the ANC was beginning to slip. But Xuma did a lot to revitalize the party. And he did it especially by establishing the ANC Youth League in 1942. And the ANC Youth League is the league that would go on to produce significant leaders, including Como, Walter Sisulu, Mbata, Olivier Tambo, Lionel Mazombozi, and perhaps most significantly, of course, Nelson Mandela. So we see the role of HBCUs in training the men who would go on to have an impact on South African politics in a way that probably no other Black South African has, aside from Nelson Mandela. We also know John Dube, the founding president of the South African National Congress, founded in 1912. So, and then of course we know that the South African Native National Congress will go on to become the ANC in 1923. And the important fact about him is, of course, he did not attend an HBCU, but his visit, his sojourn at the US, brought to the US in 1887 by the Wilcoxes, would turn critical, because he would be influenced by Booker T. Washington's philosophy, and then he would go on to develop his own institution in South Africa in the image of Tuskegee University. And we are going to look into that institution further down as we begin now to see the second leg of the impact of HBCUs in Africa, which is the modeling of Black institutions of higher learning, the modeling of historically Black colleges and universities in Africa. And the first one to be created back in 1900 the Zulu Christian Industrial School, now known as Orange High School. The first school founded by a Black person, John Dube, and modeled after the Tuskegee Institute. And as in the case of Tuskegee Institute, that institute was established with a generous donation from many benefactors, including Hudson, including Pixley, including also Wilcox. Wilcox, who has significant ties to Tuskegee and after whom many, many buildings are named on the Tuskegee University campus, including also what is home, that the pride, one of the prides of Tuskegee actually, our School of Architecture and Construction Science. The University of Fort Hare in South Africa, modeled after Tuskegee University, it contributed a lot to creating a Black elite, a Black African elite. Its alumni were part of the many, many independence movements across Africa. And in South Africa, they include, of course, Mandela, they include Desmond Tutu, they include Robert Sobukwe, and they include Oliver Tambo. The University of Nigeria, Nsukka, also established by another HBCU alum, Nnamdi Azikiwe, back in 1955, and also modeled after the land grant system, and is today one of the 5 most dynamic universities in Nigeria, with 102 academic departments. And I'm here just putting again the last one, which is the Booker T. Washington Agricultural Industrial Institute, the Booker T. Washington Institute in short, BWI, located in Kakata, Liberia, a direct outcome of President Charles King's visit to the US. Charles King actually visited the US in the early 1920s, toured a lot of cities in the US, a lot of universities in the US, but then when he went back to Liberia, a journalist asked him in a press conference, what is your most striking memory of the US? He did not go far. He said simply that if I could go back to the US, pick up an institution called Tuskegee Institute and implant it on Liberian soil, I will die a happy man. So apparently that did not fall on deaf ears. Tuskegee leadership got in touch with the Fell-Stokes Foundations located in Washington, DC, and they went to work. So the result would be the creation of an institution that today is proud to say that it has trained much of the Liberian elite class, most of the Liberian actually doctors, most of the Liberian engineers. And then they also have a dynamic association across the world, including up here in Maryland. And that school would be designed by one of Tuskegee's staff faculty, Robert R. Taylor, the first accredited African-American architects. So, and that is why also today Tuskegee has many, many ties with Liberia through the Booker T. Washington Institute, which is named actually after Tuskegee University's founder, Booker T. Washington. And here just a bunch of references for the work done. And then thank you very much for your time. And now I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thiam. That was very interesting. And I know there are some historians in our audience and that can talk about the ties also between Nnamdi Azikiwe. Right now in the African Studies Center, we have a fellowship named after Nnamdi Azikiwe because of the ties between MSU and Nsukka. So if those historians want to elaborate, please raise your hand, or we welcome your commentary. Also, please ask, you can also type your questions on the Q&A. And we have one, so I'm gonna let Chris to talk. Go ahead, Christopher.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So, Thiam, thank you. Merci beaucoup. C'était vraiment formidable. It was a great summary of the history. But as much as I am thrilled by you talking about that, because we need to let the youth and the younger generation realize of the tremendous cooperation that has existed between the African Americans as well as the Africans on the educational level. What I am very concerned about is the fact that what is happening today. So in other words, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. We have, thankfully, an increase in overall consciousness within the US amongst peoples, peoples of color, looking at the challenges ahead of us, the systemic racism that is still with us, and also how that links to the global community. In other words, what are we doing? What are you doing? What can we do to foster that and build upon the great foundation that you just very elaborately shared with us?
Thank you, Chris. And you are right on target. And that's also one of the subjects of lamentations we've been going through. That in a sense, actually, previous generations were much more progressive than we are. That they had a vision that is much more encompassing than the vision of this new generation, which tends to be more insular than it needs to be. On both sides, actually. On the side of the African Americans and on the side of the Africans, that there used to be a time when actually those people had a direct line of contact. We think about it, right? MLK was talking to Nkrumah pretty much on a daily basis. Du Bois, who we knew actually didn't even think of himself as American, actually he thought of himself as African first and American second. The idea that basically those bridges had to be established, but for some reason, after African independences were achieved, those bridges began to collapse. And again, I wish I had the answer, but I feel like this is the time to begin also to put together those bridges that used to link us with the rebirth of Pan-Africanism, because unfortunately now Pan-Africanism is a subject for academia, but how do we popularize it? How do we make young folks who may or may not be attached to particular academic institutions feel this is something for them? How do we turn it? How do we democratize it? And I think that is where the fight should be. In the same manner as the first and the second Morrill Act tried to democratize access to education by making sure that the yeoman, everybody could just have access. And that's maybe where we need to get with Pan-Africanism, because unfortunately, you do a survey on the streets with many of our youngsters, you ask them about Pan-Africanism, most have no idea.
Thank you very much. One question here is, from your research, have you found contemporary that Africans on the continent are aware of the historical link between HBCUs and Africa? That's from James.
No, unfortunately, no. Again, it is part of, it is a conversation, it is an exoteric conversation between those people actually who do research on it. And again, it is almost similar to the first question, but no, from the research, you could see even talking to the students actually on an HBCU campus, or even going to Dakar at Sheikh Anta Diop, talking to them. The first question I asked them, what are the origins of Pan-Africanism? And most of them will automatically just go back to Kwame Nkrumah. And I tell them, what do you make of Henry Sylvester Williams? What do you make of Du Bois? What do you make of C.L.R. James? What do you make of the original pioneers, actually? What do you make of the notion that Pan-Africanism was not born on African soil? It was born among those people who are part of the African diaspora, who were searching for an identity for themselves, and in the process discovered Africa. And then again, it's always something new when they hear that, to remind them that Pan-Africanism itself didn't come. So I guess we have a lot of teaching to do, and we have a lot of communication to do, and to revive the Pan-African agenda and to get it out of the campuses into the public sphere, I feel like is a project worth undertaking.
Thank you very much. I think we have some questions on the chat. Let me try.
This one says, may I know the two Ugandans you mentioned? One of them could be Dr. Akeki Nyambongo, who wrote a novel, Africa Answers Back. He studied at Tuskegee Institute and later taught on there. Yes, Prof. Nyambongo actually is very well known on the Tuskegee campus, especially among my colleagues who do African literature. But I am not sure he was the one mentioned because unfortunately, for the records, there was no mention about the names. It was just a mention about the identity of the countries where they're from. But again, maybe further research is needed here to determine who they were. And again, this is why I said towards the end that the long list of those Africans trained at HBCU, I just had to highlight those who would go on to play significant leadership roles. But then again, there are so many others who unfortunately were not recorded, partly because they stayed here and continued to do the work and just morphed into the culture. And others actually went on to just to Africa to do policy work, to join the governments, but were not also chronicled. So this is just the beginning of the work. And I guess the next step for the work is basically to dig deep and then to do some archival work to find out at the lower level who those folks were. And again, for me, this was a serendipitous finding because I was actually working on another project trying to find out basically how Pan-Africanism was about economic development, going back to the Du Bois papers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And that's when I stumbled upon the notion that if you look at all of the 5 congresses, actually, they were pretty much led by institutions of higher learning in this country. And that story was not chronicled. So that's how I began looking into what impact they could have. But that's a great question and maybe also a trigger for further research. And I see Jamie asking, okay, thank you, Dr. Thiam. Thank you, Professor Thiam. This is an important talk and historical connections. You focus on leadership of African countries in particular, and I'm wondering about the ways to trace the impact of HBCUs due to the educational experience of a broad spectrum of alumni. Oh, yes. And then again, yes, and absolutely. The more we talk about this, the more I feel like the next big project actually should be a book that focuses exclusively on this one. And then, because I think there is a subject matter there. There's a subject matter there. Because today, I think what you have is a beginning of an awakening, because there is the founding of, I think it's, I'm trying to remember, I don't want to quote the name wrong, but it is just an association that gathers all of the Pan-African universities, all of the Pan-African intellectuals. I think it is the Association of Pan-African Colleges and Universities. And I think that could be a beginning to see and to measure and to trace the impact of HBCUs on the educational experience of a broad spectrum of alumni. Okay, sorry, my question was about tracing the impact of HBCUs on a broader spectrum of African societies. Yeah.
So there is a question in the Q&A. With virtual education a real possibility, how do you think we can accelerate the partnership between HBCUs and African universities to revive the historical connections and ties that were disrupted in the post-independence years? What are the unique strengths and competencies that African universities can benefit from?
Yes. Yeah. And I think really we have entered a new era, right? Because right now this conversation keeps coming and coming. Whenever I travel actually to different universities in Africa, that's why I named this title Unbreakable Bridges, even though I realized that the bridges were a little bit shaky. How do we begin in this day and age to put back those bridges together? And the conversation actually, quite frankly, has started. But it has started in a very timid way. It has started by way of faculty exchange, by way of the Fulbright program, by way of basically random visits, random studies, but it needs to be systemized. It needs to be put there in a very systematic way. And I think actually maybe a conference might be necessary, a big conference to gather HBCUs and institutions that do work in Africa, and a big conference between HBCUs and those institutions of higher learning across Africa And I don't know what the format will be, but to begin to think of that process, to just, because you will be amazed when you get people in a room. The ideas can come and the ideas could be transformational. That was the idea of, quite frankly, of the congresses, of the Pan-African congresses, because when they were gathering from these different capitals across the US and across Europe, and then incidentally took the last one in Africa, it was about just getting people in a room and see basically what comes of it. And I think that's where we need to go. That's where we need to go. Because the potential, and then to answer the last question, because the potential, if nothing else, right, for technology transfer is just extraordinary to be left alone. Because I'm thinking of basically the research being done on HBCUs. Tuskegee right now, for instance, we have a major work on cancer research, a groundbreaking work on cancer research, to the point where actually the people who are leading it, one of them is elected actually to be the president of the National Cancer Society. So those are opportunities that can be translated across the continent for the benefit of all. Because if you do that, you have a cross-fertilization going on. If you do that, then that means also you are establishing bridges that will allow for not only those African universities to be better, but for also HBCUs to be better, because then you have basically a technical know-how that has no borders. The idea of science without borders could be established between HBCUs particularly, and it's just a win-win situation. It's a positive sum game if you do that.
Okay, somebody wrote that they would be interested into having a conference.
It's timely. We need to talk more about it.
Okay, while we wait for more questions, hopefully, I have one question for you. Okay, let Anne talk first. Let's see what Anne has raised. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, thank you so much for this, for allowing me to ask the question. And Dr. Thiam, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm talking from Purdue University, your alma mater. And it's just
Boilermakers.
yeah, it's this week that I met so many people from Tuskegee who are doing their master's and PhD here because of the dean who came, the dean of one of the science departments here who came from Tuskegee. I have a question. I have two questions, or they might just be suggestions. I'm wondering how you envision the role that the children of the African immigrants have in connecting the universities in Africa and the HBCUs, because I don't have data, but I have been watching in various social medias, and I see this a critical mass of immigrant children who study, say, at Tuskegee, Howard, maybe some of them in medicine and all that. And I'd like you to shed some light on that. And secondly, I'd also like you to shed some light on how HBCUs also interact with flagship universities and how then that ties with universities in Africa.
So that point comes with the beauty and the burden. I will begin with the burden. The burden is we have a very sloppy mechanism for knowing who those folks are, because we know them through random conversation. We know, but basically in our classes, in the conference we go to, that yes, I am the daughter of an immigrant, of an African immigrant. Yes, I am the daughter of I'm the son of an African immigrant, and I would like to connect. I would like to basically give back to the homeland, but I have no mechanism for doing it. And that is also part of the beauty. The beauty is the potential that it represents. The beauty is for somebody to be that pioneer, to say that I want to get on a journey. I want to be the one starting a process for recognizing African talent and for seeing how that African talent can be used for a continent that is in so in such desperate need for a scientific revolution, for a technological revolution, for even an economic revolution. And I think also we shortchange ourselves. And this is why also sometimes, quite frankly, I blame our political leaders for short-sightedness, for not actually recognizing that we are sitting on a gold mine that only is asking to be used, to be utilized in very effective ways. Because you look at, for instance, and I think some states have done it successfully. You look at Israel, right? It's a data-driven process. It's about knowing where those people who are affiliated with Israel are, whether they were born there, whether they're first generation, second generation, it doesn't matter. And I think the model that Africa should espouse should be a model around that idea. Because now you look at Africans around the world, they're some of the most educated. They are in all sectors of life. Everywhere you go, you find them, and yet they're benefiting any and everybody except the continent. You find them in HBCUs, you find them in land grant institutions such as MSU, such as Purdue, such as other places. But again, there is the leadership has to come from somebody who knows how to say, I want this one to be the inflection moment. I want all these educated Africans to begin to wrap their heads around the notion that African development begins with this notion. So centers of research and development right now should be all across Africa, led by people who are interested in Africa, led also by the sons and daughters of Africa who have also a mission to give back to the land. Because it's a shame that we have so much gold and yet nothing to make out of that gold. Again, it's not an easy question. But again, it's a highly political question that we can solve with institutional measures by putting in the right incentives and by putting in the right priorities for our governments across the continent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Jamie wants to talk. Go ahead, Jamie.
Great. Thank you so much, Awa. And I'm just really appreciating this conversation, the way that your talk, Professor Thiam, has generated some really good ideas. And I have a question for you, perhaps piggybacking on the last question, about the role of a land-grant university like MSU in contributing or supporting this kind of partnership, and just recognizing, sadly, the history of African studies and African study centers as has been really brought to light through the Herskovits Must Fall movement, drawing attention to the exclusion even of HBCUs that were foundational to African studies like Howard from the sort of post-World War II world of area studies. Just wondering if you have some reflections, given that MSU has a historical center for African studies, and we are a land-grant university that partnered with President Nnamdi Azikiwe when he was founding Nsukka. What are some of your thoughts on those questions?
It's a great question. And I say that Africa is really at a point in its history where it will either have to make that serious decision or it will continue to lag behind. The one thing we quite often forget, that the fact that this country took off were in very large measures due to the role that land-grant institutions played. I would say without the creation of land-grant institutions, this country would never have a middle class. So they are fundamental. And this is why I say our previous leaders were much more progressive than we are, because Nnamdi Azikiwe understood it. That's why he literally looked at the land-grant institution in this country and said that Africa needed it. Africa needed it because you look at Africa right now, what you have are elite universities that train people to do the theoretical thinking, to do the thinking that is outside of this world. to think about legal doctrines, to think about political system, to think about all that. And yet in the process, we have devoted very little in those universities, very little resources to making sure that we create universities that actually do the general work, that do the yeoman's work, that create the practical work that moves the engines of those societies. And this is why I say really right now, the most important priority and what we can learn from the land grant system is through the creation across Africa of what I call in French, université de proximité, meaning what? Neighborhood universities. That would be a blend between what would be land grant institutions and community colleges to resolve the dire issues that African countries are confronted with. Issues from basically, you look at some countries right now, like Senegal, my hometown, my home country, issues like flooding for every rainy season. How do you create the next generation of engineers and technicians that will take care of that matter for good? And also in terms of agricultural production, it is sad that for Africa, continent with 60% of arable lands, right? We still have famine there. That means basically creating those universities that would focus on research and development can begin to be the key for solving Africa's hunger issues, African food insecurity issues, and Africa can do it. That's the good news about the 21st century. By linking up with land-grant institutions here, such as MSU, such as Purdue, such as Iowa, and then also such as Tuskegee University, and begin to resolve that issue. And of course, we have nothing against, and a human being is a whole. Begin also to bring other traditional institutions on the basis of their strength. You mentioned Howard a minute earlier. It's a shame Howard should never be excluded out of anything that takes place in terms of the intellectual development of the continent. It should be part and parcel, because that's one of the reasons an institution like Howard was created in the first place. Not only to be domestically valuable, but also to be transcontinental, to be able to go across the bridge and give a hand to those institutions at home. And this is why when you go sometimes to some of these African studies meetings, always the sad part about me is it's great to have partners who are diverse, but let diversity be diversity. Where are the African Americans in the process? And again, that's a question we share, and that's a sentiment we share, and that ought to be corrected. But that's a great question.
So I have a question here. Are you familiar with African Development University in Niger? Is that the kind of model you are suggesting, universities that are in proximity to the local areas and are addressing the needs and challenges of local communities?
Yes, and this university actually, I have a friend actually who went to Purdue incidentally and is involved with the African Development University. And we keep having this conversation, right? That's a great start, but it never goes far enough. It's just a lip service. It's just basically a building that is not given the means for the politics. I like the principle, the idea, but now let us do more of these and give them the means to have an impact. And I say this, sometimes also it's a matter of priority. And I don't want to say out his name out loud here, but that was a feeling we shared, right? You have this kind of university. Now, instead of putting all of those $milliards, meaning billions, well, billions in African money, to creating basically an extraordinary amount of cabinet members who do pretty much nothing, redirect the resources. Give those universities the resources, because we have we have some really what you call progressive leaders who who understand this idea of university de proximité. But again, it's just not about creating it, right? Put there the resources behind it. For those who are familiar with Senegal, there's also a similar university to this, which is Université du Sine Saloum, which was actually created really to begin to see how we can revive what is called le bassin arachidier, how we could actually begin to have a public-private partnership, like basically a research that has an impact on the market, on people. But again, you create that university and you do not put the money up there. And next to it, you have basically a government that has about 40 cabinet members. each of them actually devouring lots and tons of money that could be used actually. And I say this, Africa will begin to take off when we begin to reconsider our priorities. So even when we have now, when we decide that Africa now is ready, is open for business, as my friend Jibril Diallo would say, that we want to re-engage with the world, we have also to do some grounding, to do some preparation, to have our priorities straight first and open up. But yes, that's a good example of a university. But again, like many other smaller universities, the resources are not put where they ought to be put.
Any other questions or comments?
And I see here, Uganda's President Museveni has 88 ministers, and that just makes my point. We need to reconsider our priorities.
Okay, so Dr. Thiam, maybe not many people in the audience know this, but I do know this. You have been very active in the Senegalese political scene, and it looks like you're about to go from theory to practice. And I was just wondering if the fact that you have been in Tuskegee in light of your talk has to do with that move to be more practical.
That's a dangerous question, but I take it. So yes, like many, I am part of those now who are just getting sick and tired of the routine, of basically the idea that Africa can do better, but then we write it in books, we talk about it in seminars, but we do not do anything about it. And part of now a new generation, a younger generation, not just myself actually, but people actually who are in the private sector, who are in the public sector, who are in universities across the world, including here in Senegal and in Paris and in France, we have decided that it's time to do something practical, and to literally, and if it takes that actually, to jump into the political fray, because we believe that Africa can do much better than it is. That we do not have our priorities right, and we need to resolve that issue. And also, and quite frankly, when we talk about 88 ministers in Uganda, it's a matter of corruption. It's a matter of basically a clientelism that needs to end across Africa, because we just believe that for this generation, at least, we believe that Africa deserves better. And some of the most critical problems, they may not just have to do with science, they may just not have to do with the economy, because in terms of science, you have some of the most educated Africans all around the world. In terms of economy, we have every imaginable natural resource across the continent. The problem is political. Now, once you come to that conclusion, I think the only course of action left is to say then, we have to do politics. And we have to be part of those people who contribute to ushering Africa, to taking Africa out of a narrow way. It's only about politics into a narrow, which tells us it is about development now, because Africa can do it. And we believe firmly that it will take all of us to do it, quite frankly. And so that's why we are not excluding that path. And we are actively involved in it. Matter of fact, before coming here, I was invited by the Senegalese community of Washington, DC, because they're getting interested now with the ideas that we are putting out there. And we are getting more and more serious now to going from, as Awa would say, Dr. Shah would say, from going from theory to practice. And again, we'll see where it takes us.
So that the fact of you being in Tuskegee, did it play any role in that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that's another great question, because when I was teaching at the University of Maryland, quite honestly, yes, it was about basically the technical issues. It's about, bringing the research that I was doing from the Institute of State Effectiveness into the classroom. It's about talking about African politics, but purely from a theoretical perspective, right? But you go to an institution like Tuskegee, there's just something, there's that zeitgeist. There's just, you find yourself among people actually who really believe that the mission and the fundamental mission of somebody involved with higher education is not only, as Marx would say, right, to interpret the world, but to transform it. So this is also, I guess, one of Tuskegee's transformational effects, about basically what do we do? Because you see the opportunities. You wake up every day with basically African Americans who are producing extraordinary work, and yet that work has absolutely no bearing on the African continent. And also, you create those projects, right? We had a multi-million-dollar project designed to actually put a bridge between us and 3 universities in Senegal: the University of Dakar, the University of Thiès, and the University of Ziguinchor. And every time you go there, you say that this research is extraordinary. And yet, those politicians, those from the Minister of Agriculture to the Minister of Economy to the Minister of Higher Education, you feel like they have no idea. They do not even understand really what is at stake here. And those are some of the things maybe that just changed my mind a little bit about the notion that, yes, we have to take our courage within our hands and realize that we know what the problem is. The problem is political, therefore the solution has to be political. Yes, Tuskegee had an effect.
If there is no more question or comments, I thank you all for attending today's lecture, and thank you very much, Dr. Thiam, for a very great presentation.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. See you next Thursday.